everyone hear me? Okay. Good evening. It's great to see you all here. I want to welcome you to Cornell's first ever Blend Conference, brought to you by the very dedicated students of Mixed at Cornell. A few of them are in the room. There goes our president, she's coming right back. And then a few of them will be trickling in. They're still helping a little bit with setup. My name is Sophie Sadu. I have the honor of serving as the Mixed advisor. They're a fantastic group that works throughout the year to support and affirm the holistic identities of our multiracial students at Cornell. Mixed understands the challenges that our multiracial students can face, from having to self-select on your application forms to being asked to explain where are you from or what are you, to classmates or professors, to navigating the complexities of affirming parts of your identity through campus culture groups or activities, and much more. Mixed truly understands that none of us are defined by percentages or divisions, and that we have full ownership of our identities, and that our mixed race backgrounds can serve as a catalyst for navigating between cultures and worlds. I'm thrilled now to be introducing our keynote speaker for tonight, Dr. Sarah Baker. We can give her who will be addressing these issues and much more in her discussion of mixed perceptions, fluidity and categorization, racial identity, and behavior. Sarah is currently a provost postdoctoral scholar at the University of Chicago in the psychology department, with a joint appointment in the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. Sarah earned her PhD in 2014 from Tufts University for her dissertation entitled Mixed Biracial Experiences from the Target's and Perceiver's Viewpoint. She also holds a Master of Science degree from Tufts, where her thesis work focused on interracial interactions. Prior to attending Tufts, Sarah received her BA in social welfare with a concentration in psychology, in addition to a minor in Spanish language and literature from UC Berkeley. Growing up in a biracial Black and white family has directly affected Sarah's growing research interests and is one of the main reasons why she has chosen to study race, prejudice, and stereotypes, with an emphasis on how contact with diversity shapes our behavior, attitudes, and perceptions of others. A fantastic opportunity to hear from her, and let's all give her a round of applause.
Thank you so much. For me, okay? Yeah? Okay. So thanks for coming on your Friday, and thank you to all the Blend and Mixed group organizers, in particular Amanda, for the invitation to speak with you all today. I'm really excited to speak to a room with individuals who genuinely care about issues facing the biracial and multiracial community. It's not an opportunity I normally get, being in academic institutions that are predominantly white on average. And so today in my talk, I'm going to be highlighting a lot of my own research and some research from others that's mainly focusing on two questions. The first question focusing around social categorizations. What types of contexts or situations can actually shift how it is we categorize racially ambiguous or racially mixed individuals? And the second half of my talk will focus more on biracial identity experiences. So looking at some of the consequences, but more so a lot of the benefits that stem from being multiracial or biracial. I'm also happy to take questions throughout the talk if anyone has any burning questions. Otherwise, we have time for questions at the end, and I'll also be in the reception afterwards. So, to start off, I'm going to actually show you a comical clip from Seinfeld that I think really captures some of the experiences people can have when they're interacting with someone who's racially ambiguous.
Shift. I hear you. Sister. Yeah, it's okay. My boyfriend's Black. Here he is. He's Black. Yeah. I'm Black. Aren't you? I'll give you a couple minutes to decide. What's he talking about? You're Black. You said we were an interracial couple. We are. Because you're Hispanic. I am? Aren't you? No. Why did you think that? You like beds. Your hair. And you kept taking me to those Spanish restaurants. That's because I thought you were Black. Why would you take me to a Spanish restaurant because I'm Black? We should talk about this. So what are you? I'm white. So we're just a couple of white people? I guess. Yeah. So do you want to go to the gap?
Nothing against the Gap, because the name like the Gap, but when this episode aired, I got really excited because it really does capture not only the assumptions people make when they're interacting with someone, so they can't really tell what racial group they may belong to, but it also shows that it can affect your behavior as well, right? What restaurants you take someone to, how you treat waiters or servers in different types of restaurants. So I just wanted to start with that and sort of frame some of the experiences I'm sure many of you in this group have had. A lot of psychology research is that social categorization really stems from this either or, in-group, out-group perceptions. People are very into forcing people into different boxes, and so for people who are multiply belonging to different categories at the same time, it becomes very difficult for people to process. And because of that, we know a lot of research shows that people will try and use various shortcuts. So they'll look for cues in the environment, whether it's what someone's wearing, whether it's the environment they're in at that given moment. But usually those shortcuts can actually cause someone to categorize someone who's racially mixed looking incorrectly, which can affect a number of different downstream consequences, stemming from healthcare treatment, romantic partner selection, you name it. Racial categorization really does strongly affect all different types of outcomes in our society. And this question is of particular importance for the mixed race population. And the recent census data in 2011 showed that about 9 million people self-identified as being mixed race, which represented a 32% increase since the year 2000, which marked the first year that the government actually allowed people in the United States to mark more than one racial background. We should also know this is largely an underestimate, they believe, as well, so it is probably actually more people than this now. The most popularly reported on the census are biracial Black white individuals, followed very closely by Asian white individuals. And statisticians have estimated that by the year 2050, they're actually expecting the mixed race population to be around 21% of the population, if not more. So when you look at all of these stats combined, it makes me as a mixed race researcher very excited, but it also makes me realize how little we really know about this population. Researchers across all fields, not just psychology, health, education, any form of research, have largely been excluding mixed race people from their research, meaning we know very little about their outcomes in a variety of domains. And so one question that fuels a lot of my own work is this question surrounding social categorization. So if I show you all this space and ask you to categorize it by race, there's a number of different categories that may pop up in your mind. These are the average categories that people tend to think of when looking at a face such as this. This face is a computer-generated, completely, perfectly morphed, 50% white, 50% black, and is an example of stimuli that's used a lot in psychology research to explore different contexts that can shift how people categorize mixed race spaces. So for those of you in this room who may think this space looks more like one of these groups or the other, there's lots of different reasons that could push why it is you think that. Whether it's the families you grew up in, the environment you grew up in, how you self-identify, even your mood has been shown to affect how the space is categorized. And so there's a number of things that can affect categorization, and one of my favorite studies done at Stanford University, I'll show you a quick example of how malleable race categorization really is. So who can tell me what racial group you think this space belongs to? Yeah. Yeah. Asian, right? Okay, so how about this one? Black, so that one's a little easier, right? So both of these faces were drawn from the same target face, who I actually think does look East Asian, but he was actually labeled either as white or either as black. This face was shown to participants, and then the face was taken away, and they asked participants to draw this person from memory. When he was labeled as white, it led to pictures looking like the first one that I showed you. When he was labeled as black, it led to pictures that looked more often like that. So you can see how easily a racial label can actually shift how it is people are remembering racially ambiguous faces, and it causes them to encode different stereotypes through their memory processes of these faces. And so we know that categorization is greatly affected by one's visual appearance. This can be skin tone, this can be hairstyle, this can be any sort of visual feature, such as things on your face as well. We also know that exposure and experience with other race groups can also shape how it is you view racial categories in general. So those who grew up in more diverse environments are going to have more exposure to people from different backgrounds, and will obviously see these faces in different ways than people who are growing from more homogeneous environments. So the question that fuels a lot of my work is what motivates people in perceiving ambiguous faces, either as white, black, or Asian? What are the contexts or situations that could actually push around when it is people categorize a mixed race individual as one group versus the other? And this question is of particular importance to me. As you heard in the introduction, I am biracial myself, yet I look, typically very white. So I have lived a very privileged life. However, my brother, who looks much more racially ambiguous than I do, has experienced things that I never have. He's been followed around a store while shopping. He's been pulled over while driving. He's experienced things in some context when people have decided he maybe fits within the African American category. But that doesn't happen to him all the time. And so this real life experience has really fueled my passion in trying to figure out which types of people, which types of situations actually do predict categorizing a person as a minority versus a majority group member. And so looking at this developmentally, some of my work does involve children. I wanted to see when these types of biases were beginning to form. And in some recent research, they actually showed that white 3-year-old children actually had the same bias categorization outcomes as adults. In this study, they were shown these biracial Asian white faces. And what you see is that when the face has a happy expression on it, which is associated with positivity, both kids and adults are more likely to categorize that face as white or as their in-group. It's a positive association. When there was a negative expression on that face, which is this angry expression, both white children and white adults were more likely to categorize that face as Asian or as the out-group. So you can see that even early on in development, kids are unfortunately learning this cognitive bias that can actually shape how it is they view ambiguous faces. Some adult work has shown that they actually don't remember racially ambiguous faces at all, whether they're Asian white, black white, or the mix may be. And so the question I had was, why and how does this bias begin developing in children? Is it something that they're learning that actually shapes how it is they categorize ambiguous faces? And so in this first study I ran during graduate school, I recruited 74 white children from the Boston area. And they were completing a memory task where they were showing 12 faces. 4 of them were black, 4 of them were racially ambiguous, and 4 of them were white. We showed them one at a time to kids, and then tested kids at the end of the study for which faces they remembered. I also was interested to see if it's when kids are learning more about racial categories as a whole, if that's what shifts how it is they view these ambiguous faces. So we measured something known as racial constancy, which is an aspect of what we call essentialism in psychology research, which is very fixed thinking about race. And so to measure this in kids, they completed a very short task. They would see stimuli such as this, and they'd answer the following questions. When this child grows up, will he look like this adult or this adult? Hopefully that question is pretty easy for all of you in this room. The second question is, if this child wanted to grow up and be black or look like this adult, could he do that? And the last question is, why or how could he do that? And so it's this reasoning that we end up coding for kids so that we can understand if they understand that race really is this fixed thing, or if they're more fluid understandings of race. And so, for example, for kids who really understand that race is a fixed thing on this last question, they would basically look at us like we were the dumbest people on the planet, saying, well, duh, of course they can't change, they were born this way. Versus kids who didn't really understand as much about racial categories, they would say things like, well, if you turn the lights off, everyone's dark. Or if you use a paint bucket, then you can paint them. A few kids talked about Harry Potter and how Harry Potter can help. So it's very obvious which kids understand these more fixed aspects about race versus which kids don't. There was one child who said, well, Michael Jackson changed his skin color. That was a very real example, and we weren't really sure how to code him. But other than that one child, it was very clear which kids really understood these more adult-like categories about race and which ones didn't. So the data I'm going to show you is the kids' memory data. So the memory for the white faces is going to be shown in blue, the ambiguous faces in red, and the black faces in green. And first I'm going to show you the data for kids who don't have this very fixed adult-like thinking about race. And what you see here is something we call the typical other race effect paradigm. So here you see white children are not remembering black faces at all, which has been shown over the years a billion times with lots of different samples. What's interesting here is you see that they're remembering white faces exactly the same as they remember racially ambiguous faces, which suggests that maybe they're viewing these ambiguous faces as white or as their in-group. Once kids gain this adult-like understanding about race, not only do you see a dramatic increase in kids' ability to remember white or in-group faces, but you see that their memory for racially ambiguous faces drops dramatically and now no longer differs from their memory for black faces, showing that there seems to be this cognitive shift that once kids learn this more adult-like thinking about race, it actually seems to push these faces to the out-group, which is the same exact data that we find in adult populations as well. So trying to build off of this question on how malleable race categorization can be, there's one main paradigm that a lot of people use in psychology research, and that's threatening someone's identity. There's a really easy way to do that with white individuals. That's actually asking them to think about how everything that they've been given them in their life is because of their white or their privileged background. This is very frightening, even if that's not true for a given participant. And what we know from psychology research is that when you are threatened, you actually have two different responses that you can do in response to that. You either will bring people into your group to kind of build your group up, or you'll push people away from your group, right, to reaffirm your sense of self. Since white individuals represent a higher status group in our society, I predicted that when under this racial identity threat, white individuals would actually push these ambiguous spaces away from their in-group and categorize more of them as Black. When they're not under threat, they should actually include more of them in their in-group. So I recruited 113 white participants online via a survey mechanism known as the Mechanical Turk, and they were assigned to one of three conditions. The first condition was that racial identity threat condition, where they reflected about how everything in their life was given to them because they're white. The second condition, they still did the same threat condition, but here I wanted to see if I could undo that threat and actually push around how do people categorize racially ambiguous spaces. So they also completed a self-affirmation task. So here participants were asked to list 6 things that are really important to them, and then reflect about why whatever's number 1, why that's really important to them. So we're hoping this positive affirmation would actually undo this threat and push categorization levels back down to our control levels. And that condition, participants simply wrote about their average day. After the writing task, I saw 20 of those racially ambiguous spaces and categorized them as either white or Black. So what I'll show you here is the percentage of those spaces that participants categorized across the 3 conditions. What you see is that participants in our racial identity threat only condition categorize significantly more of these ambiguous spaces as Black or as the out-group. Undoing that threat with our self-affirmation task actually brings these white adults' categorization levels back down to control or chance levels. And this actually represents some of the first evidence to show empirically that racial categorization really is very fluid. It really is very not always going to categorize someone as a minority group member. There are situations or contexts where maybe they'll be categorized as something else as well. And so wanting to extend this to actual social behavioral interaction paradigms, a lot of my other work focuses on cross-race interaction experiences. And so I wanted to take this outside of the simple face categorization task and actually see how interacting with someone in the lab who is racially ambiguous, how that affects their social behavior. And so in this study, I recruited 91 white undergraduates who interacted with one of 4 Confederate participants. So these were trained undergraduate research assistants on my lab team who pretended to be a participant during these interactions. Participants were assigned to one of 2 conditions. The first condition was a race known condition. In this condition, participants were told that their interaction partner was biracial Black-white. The other condition was what we call the race unknown condition. Here they received no racial information at all. They then proceeded to a 5-minute videotaped interracial interaction where they discussed campus diversity and affirmative action issues. This is to make race really a very salient topic in this situation, which should make this interaction as awkward as humanly possible, as you might imagine. So what I was predicting was that interacting with someone who you don't know their racial background should be that much more stressful than if you do know what racial background that they belong to. I'm not going to show you a lot of the social behavioral data, but in line with this interest of mine in social categorization, I also asked participants to draw their partner from memory. So after sitting across the table from them for 5 minutes talking about very stressful race-related issues, they left the room, and then we gave all the participants the Crayola multicultural Crayola crayon box, and simply asked them to draw their partner from memory. They looked at us like we were crazy people, asking them to color with crayons. But this is Jasmine, who was one of my Confederate participants. And this is an example of a picture that participants drew when they knew that she was biracial Black-white. So you can see that it's actually pretty accurate, especially the fact that you're drawing with crayons. And you compare that to the race unknown condition, and what you see here is not only a drop in the accuracy in what they remember about Jasmine, but you actually see that they don't color in her skin tone at all. So when you don't know what racial group someone belongs to, it really does affect your memory for this person, to the point where most of our participants actually just didn't color in her skin color. Regarding the social behavioral outcomes in this study, we also found that when people did not know what race she was, they were higher in anxiety, made less eye contact, and they enjoyed the interaction much less than when they knew what her racial background was. So just to summarize this racial ambiguity section of my talk, I've shown you some evidence to show that racial ambiguity can negatively affect our categorization of others. It can negatively affect our memory. That this is very prevalent across the lifespan as well. But knowing a person's race can actually mitigate some of these outcomes. It can change how they remember these faces, change how they categorize these faces, and change how they're socially interacting with someone as well. So this is showing that disclosing one's biracial identity can actually help improve cross-race interactions. But what we don't know is if that disclosure from a biracial individual really is costly to them, right? So most of this research I've shown you here so far is really focusing on this perceiver side of experiences. So the question I have in the other half of my research focuses on biracial participants themselves across the lifespan. So this way we can actually get outside of this perceiver angle and look at how these experiences actually portray for biracial individuals themselves. So biracial individuals, as I said at the beginning of this talk, are largely understudied. And this is some recent Pew data that shows from 1970 to 2013 how quickly multiracial babies and infants are being born over the years. So you can see in 2013, there are about 10% of the population, which represents a very large influx of multiracial youth in our society. Black, white, and Asian white individuals are the most popularly studied across research domains right now. But that means that even though we know very little about these more prominently known biracial groups, we know even far less about people who would identify as dual minority biracial individuals. So people who are Black Latino or Black Asian, for example, that is an area of research that has really, really been understudied and something that I'd very much like to do in future work. And so what we know is common across most biracial backgrounds is this evidence of identity flexibility. And this is usually due to the fact that biracials have several different ways that they can identify. Some will identify as being minority or majority, depending on if they lean more to one side or the other, at least for people who have a white or majority group status identity. Other people choose a biracial or a multiracial or some form of a hybrid identity to try to encompass all the different views that they have of themselves. And then lastly, there's a group of mixed race individuals who are so sick of answering these questions about what racial or ethnic group that they belong to, and they simply just want to be called human. And so people laugh when I present this last one sometimes, but it really is frustrating to have to go through your life constantly answering the same questions. At the same time, you can see there's such a large variety in the types of identities that people have, which is another reason why studying biracial populations is so incredibly complicated. There's a lot of individual variation in how people identify, how they may look, where they may live, what experiences they've had, whether they're in a two-parent household or a one-parent household, which makes it very difficult for researchers to come to firm conclusions, which is something that I'm trying to work on throughout my work and the rest of my career. One thing that we also know is very common across all mixed race types is this notion of having to choose one of your racial identities over the others. For those of you that might not know this picture, this is a very famous twin couple that was born from a white father and a half-Jamaican mother. And you can see that these twins look drastically different, yet they came from the exact same parents. And so they wrote some beautiful blogs online about how they constantly had to remind people that they're biologically related and actually twins, showing how phenotypicality really can vary so much by the role of the genetic dye, especially within mixed race families. And so because of that, we know there's a lot of negative outcomes, unfortunately, that stem from being multiracial or being mixed race. So over 14 studies have highlighted that mixed race individuals tend to have a lot of difficulty forming a true sense of self, again, because they're constantly being questioned all the time with questions such as, what are you, who are you, where are you from, are you sure your dad is really your dad? Whatever the case may be for any of you sitting in this room, these questions really do take a toll on individuals, especially when you get them in more negative contexts versus people who have genuine positive interest. And because of this, we know that the mixed race community actually experiences higher rates of discrimination, social isolation, and exclusion, not only from their friends, but also from their extended family as well. So this is some more of that recent Pew data that actually shows different types of mixed race individuals and the levels that they've experienced racial slurs or jokes, poor service in restaurants or other businesses, and being unfairly stopped by the police. And what I like to point out with this graph is that for those individuals who are part Black, they tend to report higher rates of discrimination experiences. But even if you look at people who aren't half Black, you're still finding very high levels of discrimination. This is a very pervasive experience across the mixed race community that does tend to vary a little bit within this demographic as well. But I like to focus on the positive aspects of mixed race issues in my own research, so there is positive hope for everyone in this room. So there's over 19 studies have found that overall most mixed race people are actually really proud of their mixed race heritage and proud of their mixed race identities. And this is because they've learned to appreciate both of their backgrounds. They can empathize with people from different racial backgrounds as well. And some mixed race people have reported that it actually could be a buffer to certain stereotypes. So if you're able to claim a biracial identity or a multiracial identity, you can distance yourself from Asian stereotypes, Black stereotypes, Latino stereotypes, because you're not 100% that racial group. So there are different benefits in that regard that people have cited in some work. And relatedly, there's some work and some of my own, which I'll show you in a few slides, that mixed race people actually, because they're growing up in these home environments with people from different racial backgrounds, they're actually much better able at socially communicating in different types of diverse settings. So they can function in both majority and minority environments with a little more ease compared to monoracial populations. And so I wanted to look at this very early on to see if even in infancy there was some sort of benefit stemming from being biracial or growing up in a biracial household. And so I recruited 63-month-old infants in the Los Angeles area, monoracial white, monoracial Asian, and biracial Asian white infants. And they completed what's known as an infant habituation paradigm. On an eye tracker, so we could actually record where these 3-month-old infants were looking when we showed them both white and Asian faces. The way the habituation paradigm works is you show one face at a time, over and over and over again, until a baby gets really, really bored with it, so they learn it really, really well. Once they've learned it really well and they're really bored with it, show them the same face that they already learned, plus a new face. And here you're able to look at looking times where if you're bored with something, you should automatically look at the new thing to show that you're actually able to distinguish these faces. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the phrase, what type of Asian are you, or all Asians look the same. Usually you find these typical other race paradigms, and even in infancy, where infants who haven't been exposed to lots of races, they're really good at distinguishing faces from their in-group, but very poor at distinguishing faces from racial out-groups. So this is how our paradigm works. I'm not going to show you all the data from this study, but before I show you some of the data, I'm going to show you some eye tracking data from one of these 3-month-old infants. And so what you'll see here, for those of you that haven't seen eye tracking data before, as the dot gets bigger, that represents where that infant is looking. The longer they look, the longer the bigger the dot gets. Those are little attention getters to get baby's attention back onto the screen. And you can see here the baby's focusing a lot on the eye region. That was very common across all of our babies in the study, no matter what racial background they were. Baby got bored again, so we're going to start back. And this is our touch trial, right? So here what I want you all to look at is how easy the baby is actually comparing the same features on each face, showing that this baby really is carefully trying to determine which face is the new face versus which face is the face that we made them really bored with. And so this is just a quick example of that. And so the data I'm going to show you here is actually going to reflect how many scans these babies did. And so by scans, I mean how many times they're actually scanning the different faces in different directions. What we know from a lot of face categorization work is that usually you have to scan faces a lot in order to distinguish whether they're a new face or an old face or a familiar face or not. And so what you'll see here is actually racial babies in blue and red, so Caucasian and Asian babies. You actually see that the more scans they make, the better they are at distinguishing these faces, which is in line with what we know so far with face categorization research. But what you see here with this green bar is this actually represents the biracial Asian white infants. What you see is that they actually don't need to make very many scans at all. They're actually faster at processing these faces, which we argue is actually because they're growing up in these biracial environments, constantly comparing an Asian and a white face, making them perhaps advanced face processors. This is the only study to exist right now with biracial infants that suggests that even as early as 3 months of age, infants really are being shaped differently in their social preferences and behaviors. So again, we think this might be an advanced face processing. What we know from adult research is adults tend to look at faces in a triangular pattern. And the biracial infants were also showing that pattern, which we didn't see as often in the monoracial infants. And so not only does this argue that this exposure to being in a biracial household during your first 3 months of life, regarding that original question of the other race effect, we actually found that these white infants and Asian infants also didn't show strong other race effects, because this study is also the first one to be done with infants growing up in very diverse environments. Los Angeles is very diverse. We actually didn't find that white infants were better at distinguishing white faces, or Asian infants were better at distinguishing Asian faces, suggesting that there really is a lot going on during these first 3 months of shape our social preferences. And so the question I had then was, later on in development, is there other things that growing up in this biracial household that it could shape children's preferences in different ways? And so we know from a lot of work that children prefer to learn from people who are very similar to themselves, people from their in-groups, people with similar accents even. And we know that teacher and peer race can greatly sway how much students across all ages and backgrounds identify with school and how much they want to acknowledge that school or education environment. And so for monoracial children, this is a pretty simple question, right? They have one racial in-group, therefore if they have a teacher from that racial background, they should then identify more easily with that teaching environment. However, for biracial kids, does that then mean that they need a biracial teacher in order to identify with, or do they actually have more flexible preferences in who they're willing to learn from? For example, with an Asian white child who's growing up in an Asian white household, would they be equally likely to learn from both an Asian and a white teacher? And so I recruited 246 children from the Boston area, recruited monoracial white, monoracial black, monoracial Asian, and then biracial black, white, and biracial Asian white children. So I could try and see if these differences were the same for different types of mixed race children. And they completed 3 tasks. They completed a racial identity priming task. This was done to make all kids, no matter what their background was, very aware of their racial background, or very aware of their racial identity. They then completed a learning preferences task, which is the task I'll show you today, and then a social preferences task to see if their attitudes differed at the peer or friend level. For the sake of time today, I'm not going to show you the social preferences data, but I'm happy to take questions on that later. So to prime the kids' identities, they simply did a quick little coloring task, again with that multiracial Purell crayon set, and we asked kids to color a picture to make it look like them. So white kids colored white pictures, Asian kids colored Asian pictures, and black kids colored black pictures. For our biracial children, half of them colored pictures that would represent their white or the majority identity, and half of them would color pictures reflective of their minority identity, so either Asian or black, depending on if the child was half black or half Asian. After that, children saw 8 pairs of videos of teachers from different racial backgrounds who would demonstrate uses for novel toys that the kids had never seen before. So for example, you'd say, this is how my friend uses this toy. And then we'd say, this is how my other friend uses this toy. People always laugh at that, but we counterbalance what we call switch the objects and orders and stuff like that for all of our teachers that the kids saw. After the kids saw the object demonstration, we would simply hand the toy to the kid and say, hey, can you show me how you would use this toy? And then whether they mimicked either teacher from the racial background, we would then mark if they learned from a white teacher, a black teacher, or an Asian teacher. So what I'm going to show you is the data for our minority primed biracial children compared to our monoracial minority children. People ask me about the white data, but what we know from a lot of developmental research is that children across all racial and ethnic backgrounds tend to learn a very strong pro-white bias very early on in childhood. We actually find that having a white identity for biracial children doesn't differ from monoracial white children. They both equally like to learn from a teacher who's white when those identities are made very salient. I think that question was very interesting because we know that monoracial minority children have a lot of difficulty in school, usually because they're having these constant competitions of wanting to identify as a minority, but also wanting to identify with white majority society. So what I'm going to show you here is the number of times that kids chose to learn from a minority teacher of their racial in-group. So first, the number of times that they learned from black teachers. And what you see here is that biracial black white children who were reminded about their black identity were significantly more willing to learn from a black teacher compared to monoracial black children. And you actually find the same exact effects for Asian white children as well. Asian white children who are reminded about their Asian identity are much more willing to learn from an Asian teacher compared to monoracial Asian children. And so this is some of the first evidence, not only to show that biracial children, you really can switch their identities in different ways, but it also shows that growing up in this environment actually may be shifting how willing kids are to learn from people from different backgrounds. And perhaps it's undoing and not making this pro-white bias quite as strong for kids growing up in mixed race families versus kids growing up in monoracial households. And so wanting to continue this along the developmental spectrum, I wanted to see the same question of identity flexibility continued in adulthood and could actually affect cross-race interaction behaviors as well. And so we know from a lot of sociology work and some psychology work that context and racial exposure can really sway how much a biracial person identifies at a given moment. But these types of effects hadn't ever been studied in actual social interaction settings. And so the question I had was, does thinking about one of your racial identities over the other, could you turn those on and off actually affect how it is you're interacting with people from different racial backgrounds. And so in this study, I recruited 56 biracial Black white young adults, and they were randomly assigned to write either about the racial or ethnic identity of their mother or their father, depending on which person was white and which person was Black. After that, they continued to a videotaped 5-minute interracial interaction interview with, again, a Confederate participant. Here, participants were either Black or white that they interacted with. And what I was hoping to find is if I activated the Black identity in this biracial Black-white participant, and they were interacting with a Black partner, you should see more positive same race type of interaction outcomes. If I identified the opposite or a different identity, so a Black identity prime where they're interacting with a white partner, you should see what we typically see in cross-race interaction studies, which is increased anxiety and more negative outcomes on average. So what I'm going to show you first is their expectations going into this interaction. So this is once the biracial individuals have one of their identities primed over the other, and they're sitting across the table from their interaction partner. And so this is how much they expect to communicate, get along, and like their partner. So blue bars are going to be those primed with the same identity as their interaction partner, and green bars primed with different identity than their interaction partner. What you see here is when that same identity is activated as their interaction partner, they expect to communicate better, get along better, and they expect to like their partner a lot better too. All from a simple identity switch, showing again in a social behavioral context that you really can move around biracial identities and affect social behaviors and identity. There's something else that I always study in my interracial interaction studies, is something known as nonverbal behavior. And so if I show you all this picture, in general, it's pretty much a positive interracial interaction. Their bodies are facing each other, they're smiling, they're making eye contact, and in comparison to this picture, it's a very different type of experience. And you're laughing because you're all very good psychologists, and you can see that their body language is drastically different between these two images that you can find with a simple Google image search online. And so we know that people monitor their nonverbal behavior a lot less than what they fill out on forms, or a lot less than what they're even verbally saying as well. And so research has shown that nonverbal behavior can actually be a much more accurate measurement of how well these cross-race interactions are actually occurring. And so I had a team of research assistants who, thankfully for our letter grade, had to watch every single one of these interactions alone in a room. So they got a letter grade and sometimes candy, and they coded them for basically how anxious or how comfortable these different participants looked in these either same race or cross-race interactions. So I'm going to show you two quick examples of some of these participants to give you an idea before I show you the data. So this is one of our biracial participants whose Black identity has been primed, and they were just asked the question, do you know people who have benefited from affirmative action?
So possibly myself, and I'm the type of person where, whether or not I did benefit from it, it doesn't affect how I feel. I don't think it cheapens my, sort of achievements. If I did benefit from it, I mean, I don't know people who can say like they know 100% that they benefited from an affirmative action policy, but I think in general, the fact that it's there does allow achieve, to reach goals that they might not have otherwise.
He probably felt a little anxious, but in general, he was pretty confident on what he was saying. His interaction partner is sitting across the table, and he was generally making a lot of eye contact as well. So keep that in mind when I show you this next sample, where this is a white prime biracial participant still interacting with a Black interaction partner.
I think affirmative action has several people I know. Because as I said, it gives equal opportunity. So I think.
So very drastic difference in these two different examples, where literally having one identity activated versus the other really does seem to shift not only their confidence in talking about racial diversity related issues, but also their social behavior when interacting with a person they've never met before. And so what I'll show you now is that nonverbal behavior data that my wonderful research assistants coded for me. Again, here, blue bars are going to represent those primed with their same identity, green bars different identity. And this was rating them for how interested they seemed in the interaction, how engaged, how much eye contact. And moving body is moving your bodies in a very fluid, engaged, non-awkward, anxious kind of way. And what you see is that they were rated as being more interested, more engaged, they made more eye contact, and they move their bodies much better, much more positively during these interactions when their same racial identity was activated over a different racial identity. And this is very telling because these are coders, right? Who were sitting in another room, they weren't in this situation, and they were able to read their nonverbal behavior, tell that these interactions were going much better or much worse, even having no idea whether their racial identities were prime, and they had no idea these participants were biracial even. And so I wanted to make sure that in this study, I was really actually not switching these biracial individuals' identities, sort of as what we would call a manipulation check. So I asked participants at the end of the study how much they identified with other biracial individuals, other white individuals, and other Black individuals. And what you'll see here is blue bars for those primed with their white identity, green bars with their Black identity. And regarding other biracial individual identification, you actually see that this prime doesn't shift how biracial they feel. They still very much feel like biracial individuals. However, when you look at those primed with their white identity, they self-report at the end of the study that they identify much more with other whites. And you find the switch for those primed with their Black identity. They identify much more with other Black individuals. So this not only is showing that my prime really is swaying how much these people identify with one of their racial groups versus the others, but it's also showing that biracial people have the ability to identify as multiple racial groups at the same time. So here it's showing they identify very much as being biracial, but they also identify slightly more as white or slightly more as Black. So this is some of the first evidence to show that you really can coexist in multiple racial groups. You don't simply have to identify with only one at a given moment. And so knowing that this identity flexibility question can affect social interactions, I wanted to know if there were broader outcomes that can stem from the fact that we do have multiple social identities. And what we know is that creative processes occur most often for people when they're actually literally thinking outside of the box versus when they're thinking inside of the box. So this has been shown a lot with bilingual populations, bicultural populations. People who are exposed to different things tend to be a little more creative than those who haven't. And so the question I had was, does priming a multiracial identity or getting people to think about their flexible multiracial backgrounds, can this actually boost their creativity and problem-solving abilities? And so I'm not going to show you all the data from this study, but I did recruit 58 multiracial young adults. These are any kind of mixed race. They could be 2 races, 3 races, as long as they self-identify as being multiracial. And I recruited 109 monoracial adults. They were assigned to write about either their racial identity and what it means to them, or about their average day, which was again our control condition. So in other words, if you were a multiracial individual, you were writing about your flexible racial identity and what it means to you. If you're a monoracial individual, you're writing about your singular fixed identity and what it means to you. We then have participants complete a series of remote associates tests. And so these are very commonly used in the creativity literature to look at flexible thinking in participants. And so what you do is you ask participants to come up with a 4th word that equally associates with all 3 of these words. So I'll give you a couple seconds to think about what word you think may equally apply. It's supposed to be difficult, so maybe think about your multiple identities. So here the correct answer would be house, or house paint, dollhouse, and house cat. So they did as many as they could out of 6 on this problem. What I was hoping to show is that activating this flexible mindset should actually then transfer into seeing these flexible associations between words more easily. And that's exactly what I ended up finding. Only multiracial individuals who were reminded about their multiracial identities saw significantly more of these problems compared to multiracials not reminded and compared to both groups of monoracials. So this isn't to say that multiracial individuals are more flexible on average across the board. This is showing that if they actually activate their multiracial identity or their multiracial mindset, it may have other downstream consequences, such as being able to think more flexibly on different types of creativity problems. And so I'm just going to summarize very briefly the different studies that I went over today, since I know I talk really quickly, it's just how I am. But I showed you that both the perceived identity and people's self-identification really can sway biracial treatment and biracial categorization. And this is very pervasive across the lifespan, right? So showing up in 3 months of life is very, very telling that this is an identity that is very salient to a lot of mixed race individuals. And this really can fluctuate in different ways across the entire lifespan. We know that biracial individuals face a number of challenges with wanting to fit in, with this need to belong, with wanting to know which group they need to belong to or not need to belong to. But a lot of my work and what I try to focus on a lot in my research is I think there really are a lot of tangible benefits that stem from having multiple racial backgrounds, having multiple ethnicities and experiences that tend to shape your social behaviors and perhaps even your problem-solving abilities in different ways compared to people who are growing up in monoracial environments or more monoracial households. And so today, research has really focused on this either-or concept of race. But as you saw with a lot of the graphs that I was showing today, and a lot of the statistics, it's really important that as our country is currently diversifying in every way, through language, through race, through culture, political affiliation, sexual orientation, as our society is becoming more diverse, it's really vital for us to begin pointing out the experiences that are actually going to shape how it is we treat people in different contexts. And so we have a lot of work to do, but this is the summary of a lot of the work that I've done so far. And so with that, I'd just like to thank you all for being here again, all my collaborators on this research and my funding sources. So thank you so much. Questions? Yeah.
When you were doing your study that included, like, have you talked about affirmative action, and the person didn't know in some conditions whether the person you're talking to what their race was?
Mhm.
Did you ever find that people would ask, do you mind if I ask who you are?
So we try to, the studies were set up to try and limit the actual dialogue. So it's set up where you're the interviewer, you're the interviewee, so you only answer questions and you only answer questions to try and limit things like that. Because if they did find out what race they were, it would sort of ruin the whole time of the study, right? So they were sort of prefaced to try and limit the discussion. So good question. Any other questions?
Do you know the research mixed race individuals in race by a single parent?
So there's not any data that exists with that right now. There's some in sociology to suggest that whichever parent is raising, you tend to identify a little more as that racial group, no matter what you may visibly look at. Look like all of my children and all of my friends have all been from two-parent households. So I don't have any data to speak to that. We are trying to extend some of the biracial kid research to transracially adopted children right now in Canada to see how being in a transracially adopted family, if that experience is similar to a multiracial family or not. So that's the most recent extension that we're working on.
Do you think that maybe some of the data found on transracial adoption may be applicable to multiracial individuals who have like step parents or otherwise another single parent in the home that's not biological?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it definitely could be applicable. I think it's really this aspect of whether you match your parents or not, right? It's that experience that I think is much more universal between mixed race families or transracially adopted families. And so that's one reason why we are trying to extend this in that direction to see if identity flexibility operates the same for kids and also the parent socialization strategies too. And so parents are probably going to operate a little differently in both those contexts is one other thing that I think regards that. Question over there? Yeah.
Do you know if any studies have been conducted on the factors that contribute to how someone decides which side to identify with more strongly in biracial individuals?
Yeah, so I don't have any work looking at that. The work that does suggest things is again linked to whether you're in a two-parent versus a one-parent household, the demographics of your neighborhood you're growing up in. A lot of times what you find is that racial people tend to identify differently at home than they do at school. So when they're at school, they'll turn on one identity. When they're at home, they'll turn on another identity. And that's again just more evidence that their identities really are very fluid. There's some longitudinal data to suggest that mixed race people tend to fluctuate how they identify across their entire lifespan. So you're never only going to identify as being half Asian or half Black. That really will actually change even on a daily or even hourly basis, how sociology research suggests. So it becomes very complicated to understand those identity issues.
I have a few questions.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
has there been any work done on like the effects of one of those versus things because of the environment of the household the child lives in? Like say the child has a negative experiences with one of the partner's parents or like a parent who like how that affects the perception of that race overall. And then like if they grow up in an environment where one or several of their ethnicities or identities are stigmatized, like how that affects how they
Right, so you touched on a lot of things that makes this other question very hard to answer, right? So if you are exposed to very negative experiences from one of your in-groups, you can imagine that would very much shape how willing you are to identify with that group. There is some clinical research to suggest there's a few biracial black individuals who were recruited, and one of their parents have been killed or have died because of needle exchange and things of that sort. So they actually ended up denying the Black community for that legal exchange and only claiming their white identity as a response to it taking one of their parents' lives, right? So there's some of those very extreme cases in the clinical literature, but a lot of them haven't been able to pinpoint what these specific factors are that will really shape someone choosing to deny one of their racial identities versus claiming. And again, that can also fluctuate based on the context too, so it's complicated. Any other questions?
Or do you feel like your research results may change if these studies were conducted in other countries?
So I think they could be very different. I mean, race is very much defined here in the United States in a very unique way, right? We've socially constructed race in our society here, different than it's been constructed in other places. I just applied for a grant recently to actually try and compare mixed race individuals in the US versus mixed race individuals in Hong Kong and Taiwan to try and start comparing some of these cross-cultural differences if I get funding. I hope to do that, so I'll tell the funders to give me money. But I do think some of the things will be the same. So issues pertaining to skin tone is a very universal phenomenon. So if you really skin tone rights don't fit into one of the racial groups or the other, that is something that I think universally across cultures and internationally is very pervasive. Language is always a very important marker as well within the mixed race community. So outside of the US, language also plays a larger role in how good your Mandarin may be or how good whatever your language may be. So those kinds of issues I think become weighed in different ways once you use the US context.
Has any, two questions. So has any of your research or any looked at sort of the anxiety of not really knowing like how you present or like what your identity is or should be? And then I'll like.
Yeah, so I haven't done that yet. That's one of the studies I want to be starting as soon as I start my faculty career. So one thing we really don't know is this question of disclosure, right? So when a biracial person has to choose to tell what they are versus when they don't, what is that anxiety they're experiencing, or what context they feel safer to disclose that identity versus the context where they don't feel that safe to do that, right? So we think there is a lot of anxiety for when you choose to disclose that, especially if you look like more than one racial background than the other, right? So it also depends a lot, I think, on how you physically appear, but there's not a lot of research looking at that yet. Yeah.
I guess second question is sort of to the first one. Have you, in terms of the babies specifically, did you track any data on race of their primary care?
Yeah, so for the biracial infants, all of them had an Asian mom and a white dad. It just randomly turned out that way. That is a more common marriage pattern in the US. So we actually weren't able to look at parent differences in that infant study. In the child study, almost all of them there also had an Asian mom and a white dad, and for our Black white children, they almost all had a white mom and a Black dad, which again is the most common marriage pattern. So our sample wasn't large enough to look at these influences. I have some new data I'm collecting here actually with a professor at Cornell in the psychology department, Katie Kinsler. We're recruiting kids in Chicago right now. We're actually finding that for Black biracial kids and racial kids, whichever their primary caregiver is, it does seem to be affecting how they're categorized in ambiguous spaces. So for Black biracial children, for example, if they spend more time with their Black parent, if their mom happens to be Black, we actually find that that shifts them categorizing spaces in one way. If they spend more time with their white parent, it shifts them categorizing spaces in another way. So we're trying to begin research looking at that. Any other questions? Okay. I'll also be at the reception too.
So in response to the last answer, so do you think that children who have different reactions to mixed race couples might react to being like identify as being bi or multiracial differently? Like I know that the most common pattern is like white mom, Black dad. So say there was like a Black female who has a negative impression of the white woman, Black male relationship pattern due to how that specific is Black female. So do you think that would affect her willingness to identify as a biracial?
Yeah, I think it definitely could. I think any negative or positive factors, right, can shift how much it is you want to identify with one group versus the other. The experiences you've had, how you've been treated walking down the street when you're walking with one parent versus the other, all these things can shape, especially in childhood, right? There's one thing that's been documented in some sociology work that suggests that biracial children tend to really worry about the time when they actually start to identify more with one group over the other because they are very worried about, ruining the relationship with one parent. So this has been documented in some sociology work to show they really do struggle with, they do identify with maybe one group. They don't want to make mom or dad feel negatively if they don't actually identify more with the other group. So that's been documented a little bit more extensively. Any questions?
So you cited this study on multiracial. If someone is primed as being multiracial, then their performance on creativity challenges gets better.
Right. Think about your multiracial identity to be better in school.
Well, this is where I'm going actually.
That's what I
also, the Pew has positive associations with being comfortable and like understanding your own identity too.
Right.
So I guess my question is, do you think that students that participate in Cornell Mixed are going to get better grades?
It's a great study. If you guys would like to do the study, I'll pay you all. Yeah, I think it's definitely possible, right? And that's what we're starting to just extend that creativity work to children as well. We're finding the same results in kids. So we're working on writing that up, but also outside of the racial domain, reminding anyone that they have multiple social identities. We all have multiple social identities. They don't have to be race. So I've actually replicated that creativity work to show that it not only boosts creativity in kids, but it also shapes the racial categorization outcomes and being more flexible also. So the next step is to actually see if these multiple identity mindsets can actually improve cross-race attitudes and cross-race behavior as well. But I do think being in these positive mixed-race groups and positive mixed-race environments should actually make you prouder of these mixed-race identities. But remember, as the data shows, you have to be reminded of that identity in order to see these boosts, right? So oftentimes what we find is mixed-race students in predominantly white institutions tend to not be thinking about their mixed-race identity when they're in a testing situation. They tend to actually think about their minority identity. And I have some work that I didn't present today looking at stereotype threat data in biracial black white adults, where if you activate their black identity, they perform not very well on the test. If you activate their white identity, they do very well on the test. Not activating either identity, you actually find they perform just as poorly as their black identity. And that's because when you are in a testing environment, you tend to focus on your minority identity more than a mixed race identity. So I think because of those reasons, people really need to be aware of the fact that they have a mixed race identity to see something like that. So. Any other questions?
Have you done any research on the interactions between a biracial individual interacting with an individual that's not one of their minority or majority races?
So I haven't done that yet. I think it's an interesting idea that if you can activate one identity the other, or maybe just a multiracial identity in general. What we know is that if you think about a common identity with someone, whether you're both women, whether you're both students at Cornell, it actually can improve those interaction outcomes. So I haven't extended this outside of their individual racial domains, but I would imagine they should be better at interacting in most diverse situations, just because of their ability to think from other perspectives, possibly more easily than monoracial stuff. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll get the reception. Sure.
So you said that most of your ladies that you work with have a more white parent or minority parent. Do you think that your advantage to data if one parent is also biracial, or both parents are?
Yeah, so I think that if you do have a parent who is mixed race, it's going to create a very different family dynamic, right? So if you are mixed race and you're raising a mixed race kid, that parent is already going to know a little more about how to raise that child. Parents who are both monoracial, they're raising a kid, which is how it's similar to transracially adopted situations. They're raising a kid who is from a different racial background, right? And so they're not necessarily as prepared to be raising a kid from a mixed race background. So I do think it could be easier, but oftentimes it depends on how the kid physically looks, the school districts that they may be in, and so there's still a lot of factors that can sway that. So again, it's complicated, but that would be my guess on how it would operate. For dual minority biracial kids, we don't know as much about that group. I'm trying to recruit them right now in Chicago. But I do think that not being able to identify with the white majority group in our society really does dictate very different outcomes for those types of individuals compared to people who do have the ability to claim a white identity versus those who don't.
Is there any data on whether certain multiracial people are more likely to identify as such based on the statistics? Because Black people are historically like multiracial or have long history of being multiracial, but perhaps wouldn't identify as such because of the stigmatization of the service.
Right. So you find most mixed race people, if you're half white, half minority, you tend to identify a little more as your minority group, just because it's not the norm, right? So it tends to be what happens. tend to identify more minority issues from being raised in your biracial family. So you find on average, it's rare for people to claim a white identity fully. They tend to claim a biracial identity instead. So you don't have a ton of variation there. Whether or not there's certain things that predicted, again, this gets back to what I said before, is there's lots of factors that will push whether they choose one versus the other. But you do find on average people tend to identify minority side than their white side.
Are multiracial agents predicted more likely to identify as multiracial?
There's not a ton of data that exists out there. Some data suggests that might be true. We also know that women in general tend to adopt a multiracial identity more often than men do. So again, this is linked to this mixed idea and discussion surrounding that. There's not a ton comparing the percentages of people, again, because their identities do fluctuate. So if I test people tomorrow versus if I test them next week, they actually identify very differently in most contexts. So, okay, so I think we have the reception time now.
Yes, we have a reception. This is also just a friendly reminder that we have more events going on tomorrow. There are cards out on the table on the back. There's a whole schedule. You're welcome to come to as many as you can, as few as you want. You can choose. So please, we can all go enjoy the reception, and Dr. Vieder will be there if you have any further questions.
Thank you.